Thanks so much for joining us today. Michael Ceccarelli is with us. He is a bereavement counselor at Hospice Savannah and the Full Circle Grief and Loss Center. Michael, thanks so much for being here today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I want to say that you are number one to identify this, the leader of the suicide loss support group that I joined in Savannah. So I'm very grateful to you for that. How many of us are there? How many people who have survived the loss of a loved one by suicide? And that could be a friend as well as a relative or a spouse or a child. And for all of those reasons, I imagine that number's pretty big.
So the numbers in my mind, frankly, can be skewed. But like in the realm, according to the World Health Organization, last time I checked, it was like somewhere between 700 and 800,000 people die annually by suicide. And I will check the figures on this.
Well,
Give me
I do have one figure, and this is why, but we've talked about this before about, those are identified suicides. So the numbers could be larger than this. But when you
I think
mentioned,
so,
yeah,
frankly.
National Institutes of Health estimates 700,000 die by suicide each year. Therefore, 60 million people are added to the suicide loss survivor numbers annually. But again, for whatever that's worth, it could be a larger number. Nonetheless, it gives us a thumbnail view of how widespread this issue is. And yet, I lost my father by suicide about a year and a half ago. I lost my brother in the same way about 9 years before that. And you would think that I would be the first person on the doorstep of a suicide loss support group. And I wasn't. It took me a while to figure that out. After my father died, I finally realized the value. And I was going to ask you, what explains that? I can give you my answers, but I'm sure you see this fear and resistance among others.
The reality is difficult to face. It is painful, and as humans, animals, even we don't we avoid pain. We avoid the path of least resistance, and our brain is thinking, maybe we're coping well by compartmentalizing and digging because every death is a traumatic experience. It is a trauma. It is a
Yes.
trauma event. When you bury that. I use this metaphor a lot. I think of like like a hardwood floor in a house, and if you spill red wine all over the hardwood floor and just put a carpet over it, it's gonna stain.
Whatever you
And
push under the rug is going to
exactly.
come out in some way. And that's the analogy or the metaphor that I use.
And
So you're so
and
right.
and I view that hardwood floor as like your wellness, your mind's eye, and when there's a stain in it, it's it's. I always recommend cleaning up the mess before it stains. Does it always stain? No. But does it have the potential? A- Absolutely.
And that's a very good point because there are those of us out there who can move along with life. But suicide survivors are at a greater risk of many things. And I'm going to ask you about that. But I'll tell you that just to echo what you said, felt like I didn't want to dive deeper into my pain immediately after I lost my brother. I needed to not be in it in order to function, I felt. And I didn't want to be reminded of my loss regularly or even be around other people and sort of feel the exponential weight of their loss on top of mine because I was afraid of that darkness. I did not see that there was some lightness or some light that you could get by connecting with others. I did see that when I joined your group after I lost my father, and I realized that I had missed out on some important aspects of
I
grieving.
can say
So,
is typical or relatively typical is the avoidance. I mean, most people in the earliest stage that I've observed tend to dissociate, and I do believe that is a typical response. And from the brain standpoint, it kind of makes sense.
mhm. Yeah,
Right.
it's not that it doesn't serve its purposes. It's just that it can't go on forever because what you bury or what you try to cover with a carpet will come through in one way or another. And that leads me to my follow-up question, which is what shocked me when I lost my father to suicide was to learn that suicide loss survivors are at an exponentially higher risk of dying by suicide themselves, if not suffering from depression or PTSD or a combination of all of the above. And when I realized the risks associated with not properly grieving and dealing with that, and with compartmentalizing or disassociating or however you handled it, that's when I decided to make this a mission and start spreading the word. But, what other risks do you see associated with not dealing with the grief or not coming together to connect with others to handle it?
There are increased risks. But that doesn't mean that it's predestined or preordained.
Yes.
I think for those who are survivors of suicide, and we're talking about like finding a group and or using more. I don't not I don't want to say positive or negative, but certain
Mm-hmm.
coping skills,
Mm-hmm.
like you know, pretending it didn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some people do that,
Mm-hmm.
Do I recommend that? No. But does it work for some people? Yes.
Right. But that pretending it doesn't happen, that taps into something that's very important to me. And that is that you end up leading sort of an inauthentic life. I mean, I
Yes.
struggled to talk about my brother's death for years because it is a very difficult subject to plunk in the middle of a conversation. And so it felt easier to just avoid it. But I was not being my true self. I was not being my whole self. There is a phrase, disenfranchised grief. Can you explain that? And also tell us why that particularly impacts suicide survivors.
So like disenfranchised grief is grief that there are social mores or societal expectations that affect perception of the death or event. Um, and it tends to happen more in like stigmatized or disenfranchised communities, like suicide.
Mhm.
Suicide historically has been a topic that no one wanted to touch, and I would imagine largely because it is so painful, Palace. That might be a reasonable explanation as to why historically people did not want to talk about it. But as we learn more, we're a social species talk communicating being curious about our emotions, and that's the key to our success, you know. um
So it's a kind of death that you don't feel comfortable grieving
yeah.
openly. It actually
So
makes other people uncomfortable.
yeah, it makes other people uncomfortable.
Yes.
A lot of times you'll see it, like examples, like when someone dies by suicide, the obituary will be like, person died suddenly, a drug overdose. Very, very rarely do people put that in obituaries. And frankly, I've known many people who have died from drug overdoses, and I have known one person, their parents put it in there specifically as something like you're doing, advocacy, awareness, things that we need to talk about, because it happens with same-sex couples, you know. People think they it's it's different, so it's less than or something like that.
Yeah.
And
And that is well put, less than, sort of not as valid as or as real as. I do want to end on somewhat of an up note because it's important to me that people who have lost a loved one to suicide learn that there is a life worth living, so worth living, especially because we've lost someone who can no longer enjoy life. It's like almost our obligation to keep living the fullest, most authentic, and most fulfilling life possible. But that leads me to the question, what one thing would you say to a suicide loss survivor if you met one right here, right now?
I say that pain and comfort can exist at the same time. That is a reality of life. Life and death are the same thing. They're part of the natural world. Suicide is still death, albeit unnatural, but it doesn't mean that we have to focus on all the darkness, because a lot of part of healing and grief is honoring and celebrating the people that we loved.
Mhm.
Those are we love them, and to continue to celebrate. And I also tell people, you're still alive. Act accordingly. Build a life that you want to live. That's worth living in, you know?
100%. 100%. And we did talk about the fog that was in Savannah this
That's
morning.
right.
And you said
Yes.
it's a reminder that we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Any of us don't know, or none of us know. But we are reminded by events that are dark and shadowy, that we need to focus on the present because that's all we have and make the most of it, as you said, to celebrate it. So I celebrate you for running this group here and providing critical support for the community in Savannah.
Well, I'm just
Um,
happy to have the opportunity with Hospice Savannah. Uh,
yes. Yes, we're grateful for organizations and for people like you who are in and make up the organizations.
Thank you.
For people outside of Savannah, how do you find help?
They are, you can locate them on a state to state basis. Internationally, I would imagine that there are similar programs. We were talking about like we were talking about New Zealand, for
Mhm.
instance. I've used resources from New Zealand and Australia in the work that I do here. So, it's
That.
I do want to make a differentiation, and here at Hospice Savannah, all of our groups are professionally facilitated. That is not always the case. That does not mean that support groups do not have value. It's because death is a traumatic event. Um, it helps to have someone there that's familiar and trauma informed practice to make sure that people don't get worse in the group.
That's a very,
Um,
very, very important point. So make sure that the leadership is qualified or certainly competent if they don't have the actual certification.
but
Very,
again, they still have merit and
yes,
still have
yes.
value, because adults learn best from hearing other people's stories, frankly.
I think people, just in general, humankind learns best from
Yeah.
listening to other people's stories. So thank you for being here and letting me share my story, both here and in the group. And again, thank you for the work you do, Michael.
Well, thank you for the work that you do
Thank
and
you.
spreading awareness, because we need it more than, honestly, more than ever.